And welcome to my first video on how to use science in world building. Science is something that has not been used as much as it could have been when it comes to world building. This may be because in the past we've had more history buffs who are the ones picking up the quill and writing the fantasy genre stories that we've seen. And, it could be that the science nerds are too busy staying in the lab. They're too afraid to leave the lab. I don't know why we're not leaving the lab. We need to get out the lab more because there's so much that we can be doing by sharing science with the world through fantasy. Come on, nerds, out the lab. A passion for history really does come through with pretty much any fantasy book that you pick up these days. There's an expectation that you will build up these worlds. You will understand the ages gone by when you pick up an epic fantasy. But I've never heard anyone say anything about, I'm going to feel a passion for science when I read a story. And I think this is a missed trick. And I think it's something that's changing. We're seeing more books like N.K. Jamison's stories that really have a science focus coming through in the worlds that they've created. And I think it's a trend that's only going to continue. So this is hopefully a video that will help you get there as well. In a genre that's always on the eternal hunt for something new, using science to change how we construct our stories, how we construct our worlds, is a way that we can do that, how we can give something new to readers. So there are loads of fantastic channels out there already that have covered world building before, and I really do recommend that you check them out. Things like Brandon Sanderson's lectures, link in the description below. Go crazy, there's a lot out there on knowledge of world building already. But that's not what we're going to be exploring today. But before I start, I'm going to have to break this concept down. We're talking about two things when I say science. First of all, you've got science as in the knowledge, the science that we have built up over the millennium. Things like how bacteria work, how fire heats things. It's all, that was terrible science. I'm going to get kicked out the PhD club for doing this. But anyway, there isn't a club, by the way. We don't have embroidered lab coats or anything. We really don't. We definitely should. Science being the knowledge that we have accumulated over the years, the knowledge of how microorganisms work or how the brain works, all these different things which we are, hard-won battles of scientific knowledge that we have developed, probably is still wrong about for a lot of it, but the point is that we know more than we did yesterday and hopefully we'll continue to know more tomorrow than we did today. Anyway, that is one element of the science. The other element is how the scientific method has evolved over the years. So we've got science the knowledge, science the methodology, both of which will be very important. Now, science isn't linear, and I'm talking about both the knowledge that we have and the scientific methodology. We can take huge leap forwards over the space of years, and then something awful could happen. That's actually quite terrifying. The idea that, something bad could happen and take away all the science knowledge that we currently have. That kind of thing can and has happened in the past. We're talking, the destruction of scientific texts by religion or natural disasters wiping out whole areas with libraries and knowledge and people with the knowledge in their head just poof, fire, whatever it was. This is why in our stories you can have society progressing really well and then something happening that takes that knowledge away and maybe leaves behind remnants of how the knowledge had built up over the years, but all it is are just the shadows of what science was. Why does any of this matter for world building? Well, beyond an idea I would love for someone to write about, which is where you have maybe two scientists battling over these experiments that they're doing, trying to understand magic, but they're both coming at it with two very different scientific reasonings for it. There are some really interesting applications of this, and there's a lot that we can do to make sure that when we're telling a story, we make it seem more believable. This is through making sure that the scientific knowledge and the scientific methodology match up in our stories. All too often, what writers will do is give characters more knowledge than is appropriate for that time. They'll perhaps have people have this very flawed method of science, and yet they know everything in the world. As a reader, you're sat there going, how? Were you just really lucky with the guesswork? It's okay for people who care about this kind of thing. It can be a little distracting, which is why it's really important to marry the two together. Now, this doesn't mean though that they have to come together. There's a really cool way to break the two, which is by giving your world a feasible reason why people would have more knowledge than their scientific inability, shall we say, would actually allow them to have. What I mean by this is by having a system of knowledge that gives you insight into something that you wouldn't have. Say, for example, you have people who have a superpower of X-ray vision or the ability to see things at a microscopic level, which means that they know that bacteria exist. Even though things like a microscope hasn't been invented, even though the glass working capabilities are too poor to allow for a lens to be created enough to see microscopic organisms, they can see it. So that means that their advances in that area are so much further along than they should be. And it means that they still haven't developed things like the window because they haven't worked tapered glass, but they know about microorganisms. So there are some really interesting ways you can combine these two and mix them up and think of it like levels, dialing the ability of your culture to deal with scientific methodology or dialing down their insight into science, or not just one aspect of science, dialing up their understanding of anatomy, but dialing down their understanding of physics. Have a play, see what you come up with. I bet you come up with some very interesting worlds by doing this. I'm linking in the description below to a fantastic timeline that covers basically most things that ever happened over the course of history that could be in some way related to science. Read it, have fun, just go for your interest. It's really quite fascinating. It's about things like how different technologies advanced, things that allowed us to later do science, also how our knowledge of certain things evolved, like how our knowledge of how photosynthesis works or our knowledge of how genetics work. Now, it's taken a really long time to get to where we are in this knowledge. And there's still so much that we don't understand. Things like consciousness, why we dream. There's lots of questions that we've still to answer. And this is because these discoveries are limited by our scientific capabilities of the time. This is a factor that's really important to take into account when world building. If you had cars in ancient Greece in your world, I as a reader, unless that was some kind of satirical fantasy, I am going to be thrown by it. And that's what it feels like when we find that there is science that has been knocked out of place in world building. A big mistake that is done quite a lot with this is our knowledge of anatomy. Now, we actually got that wrong for a lot of history. I don't know if you know about it. I'll cover it in a future video. It's a really cool topic. We didn't understand this. We had organs in all the wrong place, organs that didn't exist existing. It was bad. And that was mainly because of the societies that we lived in. Things like religion banning autopsies, so we couldn't actually figure out what was going on. This means there are real life implications in your world of this lack of knowledge. If I'm reading a story where you have characters on the battlefield, surgeons cutting away, being very accurate in what they're doing, and yet the context of that world should not have that level of knowledge, then I am going to be thrown. For the vast majority of our history, the best we could do was maybe chop off a limb if there was a problem, drill a hole in the head, tripping if we had to. We were often bad at that one too. But the point being that there is a limit to the knowledge of the time, and that should be factored in when designing your settings. Watch out number 2. And if you don't do this one, what it can lead to is the world feeling quite flat scientifically. So this is where you don't recognize that different cultures develop at different paces. This happens quite a lot in our world. Different societal factors will mean that one culture is able to expand scientifically at a faster rate than others. And it means that if you do this in your world building, then it makes everything seem so much more complex and real. And I love it. Do it. It's great. If you're looking for a cool timeline of Western versus Eastern culture, I'll also link that in the description below. I found it while I was doing my research for this, and it's a very cool way of demonstrating how these different cultures develop differently. You want to do this in your world building setting. You want to maybe have one culture develop faster than another. There are lots of fantastic ways of doing that. Making it so that the climate is harsher, and so more people have to spend all their time surviving rather than pursuing the truth of knowledge, or making it so that there is a religion that is oppressing science. It's perhaps burning people, not at the stake. Don't do the stake. Stake's been done. Do something new. Have Scorchy do it. Scorchy's nice. Scorchy's nice. You could do that. You have a king that is obsessed with the science of death. So maybe they have really advanced knowledge of death, and how the body dies. At what point do we actually die at? This is something we don't know, but everything else is just forgotten about. Really go crazy with what you do with this. Which leads me on to my final point for you to ponder, which is about where science present and science future really can play in your stories. This is what I was talking about earlier in terms of concepts that we don't have answers to right now. What is consciousness? Well, we've got theories. Science isn't able to actually understand that. But hey, you're fantasy writers. You can do anything. Create a tool or a magic system that allows us to understand what consciousness is. If you do this, you'll end up in a territory of fantasy that's more psychological fantasy, maybe even philosophical fantasy, where you're trying to explore concepts like the meaning of life, the meaning of dreams, the meaning of death, all these very cool areas that have almost a science fiction feel to them, really, but you're doing it in a fantasy setting. If you plan to do this, I salute you. Prepare yourself. It will be painful. You have to ask yourself these tinsy questions like, what's the meaning of life in order to do it? Which, coming up with answers to that, easy peasy, you'll be fine. Have fun. I really look forward to seeing what you come up with. So that's it for this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learnt something. I hope you are inspired to use science more in your fantasy world building. Next week's episode will be my first in the evolution of fantasy races. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. In the meantime, if you want to comment in the chat below about topics that you would like me to cover, I've got a long list. I'm going to be working my way through it, but I really want to make sure that I hit topics that you're actually going to be interested in. And please do also tell me about ways that you're using science in your world building. I would love to hear it. It really is a passion of mine. I'm fascinated by it. Get commenting. Looking forward to hearing from you. Happy nerding. Bye, nerds.